A new energy storage station that uses sodium-ion batteries is up and running in South China's Guangxi-Zhuang Autonomous Region because besides that, sodium-ion batteries are safer, cheaper, and more sustainable than lithium, especially for stationary uses, like in energy storage.
In a quiet industrial park outside Nanjing, a company that once bet everything on lithium just admitted defeat and signed the papers anyway. Somewhere in Seoul, in Detroit, in Brussels, engineers are staring at the same report, asking the same question. How did we not see this coming? For 20 years, the world assumed the battery war would be fought over lithium, a rare, contested, fiercely guarded metal. China just proved that assumption wrong, using something so common it sits in your kitchen cabinet. This isn't a story about a new battery. It's a story about who just quietly took control of the next decade, and whether the rest of the world even noticed in time. The plant that didn't need permission. LG Energy Solution is not a small player. It holds close to 1/10 of the global battery market, runs factories on 3 continents, and supplies some of the biggest car brands in the West. When a company like that needs to build something new, it usually has options. It can build in Korea, where it's headquartered. It can build in the United States, where it already runs joint plants with General Motors. It can build in Poland, where it supplies European automakers.
LG Energy Solution Poland is driving sustainable electricity consumption by pioneering a made-to-order renewable energy package.
Or in any of the dozen countries where Western governments are actively begging battery makers to set up shop with tax breaks and subsidies. In January 2026, LG announced where its new sodium-ion battery pilot plant would go instead, Nanjing, China. The reason wasn't hidden or complicated. A Korean trade publication reported the plan plainly LG needed to lean on China's supply chain, especially for cathode materials, because that supply chain simply didn't exist anywhere else. Not in Korea, where LG has spent decades building its reputation. Not in Europe, where governments have poured billions into battery independence. Not in North America, where entire trade policies exist just to pull manufacturing away from China. Only in China. Think about what that actually means. This isn't a story about China selling a finished battery to the world and everyone else buying it. That would be ordinary trade, the kind that's happened for years. This is a story about China owning every single step that comes before the battery even exists. The raw cathode powder, the processed anode material, the specialized machines that press it all together into a working cell. LG had 2 real choices on the table, and a trade report laid them out: almost clinically build in the West without any of that support, or build inside China and accept the dependency that comes with it. There was no third option quietly waiting in the wings. No workaround through a friendly ally. No, just wait a year and build it somewhere else once the technology matures. The infrastructure that mattered simply didn't exist outside Chinese borders in early 2026. That's the moment worth sitting with. Not a flashy headline about a battery breakthrough. A quieter, more uncomfortable moment where one of the world's largest and most capable battery makers looked hard at its own options and realized none of them were good enough without China standing behind them. It's worth remembering, too, that LG is not the kind of company that makes decisions on impulse. It spent decades building supplier relationships across continents precisely so it never has to depend on one single source for anything critical. That's what makes the Nanjing decision so telling. A company built specifically to avoid this kind of exposure ran the numbers, checked every door available to it, and still walked through the one in China, not out of preference, but because none of the others were even unlocked. And LG isn't alone in facing that wall. Western battery makers spent the last 5 years chasing better lithium chemistry, squeezing more range out of nickel and cobalt blends, fighting over access to lithium mines in Chile and Australia, racing each other toward faster charging times. Billions of dollars and thousands of engineers went into that fight. While all of that was happening in plain sight, a different battle was being fought quietly inside China, one most of the industry wasn't even watching closely. It centered on an element so common, so unglamorous, that almost nobody in the West thought it was worth fighting over at all: sodium. By the time Western companies looked up from the lithium race, the sodium fight was already over. China hadn't just built a better battery chemistry. It had built the only road that leads to one at scale. And now every company on Earth that wants to walk that road eventually has to ask China for permission first, whether that permission comes as a supply contract, a joint venture, or as LG discovered a building permit in Nanjing. That's where this story actually starts. Not with a battery, with an element nobody thought was valuable enough to fight over, until it was too late to catch up.
It's redefining the world's EV battery industry.
This is going to be a next step of the whole automotive industry, but also going to change the way of the design philosophy.
The element nobody wanted. Here's the strange part of this whole story. Sodium isn't rare. It isn't hard to find, isn't buried in some remote mountain range, isn't controlled by a small cartel of mining nations. It's in seawater. It's in rock salt. It's in soil almost everywhere on the planet, sitting in quantities so large that running out isn't a phrase that applies to it in any meaningful sense. For decades, the battery industry looked right past it anyway, because lithium did the job better, and for a long time, better was all that mattered. Nobody in a boardroom was fighting over sodium contracts, because nobody thought there was anything to fight over. A sodium-ion battery works in a way that's almost identical to a lithium-ion one at the level of pure physics. Both store energy by moving ions back and forth between two electrodes as the battery charges and discharges, cycle after cycle. The chemistry is a cousin, not a stranger, an engineer, who understands one can read a diagram of the other without much trouble. But the raw material sitting at the center of each one couldn't be more different in how it's controlled. Lithium is mined in a small handful of countries: Australia, Chile, Argentina, and China itself, and global demand for it has turned lithium into as much a geopolitical bargaining chip as a mineral, with prices that swing wildly based on politics as much as supply. A trade dispute, a mining strike, a new export tariff, any of it can send lithium prices spiking overnight, and every automaker relying on it feels the shock at once. Sodium, on the other hand, is everywhere, controlled by no one. Nobody holds leverage over the world's supply of table salt, and nobody ever will. For years, that abundance didn't matter much, because sodium-ion batteries simply stored less energy for their size than lithium-ion ones did. A sodium battery in an EV meant a noticeably shorter range for the same weight of pack sitting under the floor. Engineers across the industry filed the idea away as promising but impractical, something worth revisiting. Eventually, once the chemistry matured, arrived faster than almost anyone in the West expected it to. In 2026, a German research team tore down a commercial sodium-ion battery built by the Chinese company Hina and ran it through the exact same battery of tests used to benchmark Tesla's lithium-ion cells, the kind of rigorous, apples-to-apples comparison the industry actually trusts, not a marketing claim dressed up as data. The results, published in the peer-reviewed journal Cell Reports Physical Science, showed something the battery world wasn't fully ready for. Hina's sodium battery matched Tesla's performance and manufacturing quality on key benchmarks. Not close, not getting there, matched. That result mattered enormously, because it wasn't a lab prototype boasting about theoretical potential on a slide deck somewhere. It was a battery that Hina was already manufacturing, already installing in real products on real production lines, tested independently against the gold standard of the entire EV industry. And it came out even. The gap between promising idea and genuine competitor had quietly closed while most of the industry was looking somewhere else entirely. Still convinced sodium was a decade away from mattering, there are still real limits worth being honest about. Sodium-ion batteries still struggle more than lithium ones in cold weather, losing more charge and performance when temperatures drop. Their energy density, how much power they pack per kilogram of weight, still trails the very best lithium cells on the market today. Nobody serious in the industry is claiming sodium has fully replaced lithium, and nobody should. But for grid-scale energy storage, for city cars and delivery vehicles, for anything that doesn't need to squeeze every last mile out of a single charge, that remaining gap stopped being disqualifying. It became a trade-off worth making, especially when paired with a raw material that costs a fraction as much and never runs short, never gets tangled in a trade war, and never depends on a handful of mines controlled by a handful of governments. That's the technical story, and on its own, it's already significant enough to matter. But technology alone doesn't explain why China ended up years ahead of everyone else on it. A breakthrough in a lab is one thing, building the entire industrial machine to turn that breakthrough into millions of working batteries is something else entirely, and it's the part most outside observers miss. That part of the story isn't really about chemistry at all. It's about patience, about 3 companies that started building this future while the rest of the world wasn't paying attention to a metal everyone assumed didn't matter enough to bother with. 3 companies, 1 quiet build. CATL is a name most people outside the battery industry have never heard, despite being the largest battery manufacturer on Earth by a wide margin.
Chinese battery producer CATL, the biggest EV battery supplier in the world.
For 7 consecutive years, CATL has become the world's top EV battery producer.
It supplies cells to automakers across the globe, from Chinese brands to major Western names. And it has spent the last 5 years running 2 parallel projects that most casual observers never connected to each other. In public, CATL kept doing exactly what everyone expected of it, improving its lithium cells, chasing more range, chasing faster charging times, competing head-to-head with every other major cell maker on Earth. Behind that public race, it was quietly building a second track entirely, one built around sodium instead. It's the kind of dual strategy that only makes sense if you're already thinking 5 years past whatever everyone else is arguing about today. CATL announced its first-generation sodium-ion battery back in 2021, a small, almost overlooked milestone at the time, buried under bigger lithium headlines. Lithium prices were still dropping that year, and few people in the West saw any reason to take a lower-density alternative seriously. CATL kept going anyway, treating it less like a side project and more like an insurance policy against a future nobody else was planning for. By 2025, the company launched a dedicated sodium-ion product line called Naxtra, and it wasn't framed as a pilot or a demonstration. CATL says it's already manufacturing Naxtra cells at scale, with real production volume behind the name. In 2026, the company went a step further, confirming it would begin mass production of a broader sodium-ion line before the year is out, with deals already signed to supply both an automaker and a company that runs grid-scale energy storage stations. 5 years, 3 separate milestones, 1 straight line, and almost nobody outside the industry noticed any of them happening in real time. CATL didn't do any of this alone, and that's the part that turns one company's bet into an entire industry's head start. BYD, the Chinese EV giant that now outsells nearly every automaker in the world on its home turf and is expanding aggressively overseas, is building its own massive sodium-ion production facility, a direct signal that this isn't CATL chasing a niche, but an entire national industry converging on the same material at roughly the same time. When your biggest domestic rival makes the same multi-billion-dollar bet you just made, that's not coincidence. That's confirmation that everyone at the top already saw where this was going. Chemev, a smaller and far less famous Chinese EV maker, started offering its EV3 model with a sodium-ion battery option back in 2024, 2 full years before this story became a headline anywhere else. That means ordinary Chinese consumers have already been able to walk into a dealership and drive home a sodium-powered car for 2 years, quietly, with almost no notice outside the country. No press tour, no global launch event. Just a working product, sitting on lots, being bought by people who never gave a second thought to what was under the floor of their new car. Behind all 3 companies sits an even less visible layer that matters just as much. The suppliers nobody outside the industry has ever heard of. A company called Rongbei Technology became CATL's main cathode supplier for sodium-ion cells, locking in 60% of its procurement needs through 2029, a contract length that only makes sense if both sides are certain the demand is coming and coming for years, not months. Rongbai finished a pilot production line handling 6,000 tons of material in 2025, just to prove the manufacturing process worked reliably at scale, and it's now racing toward 50,000 tons of annual capacity, with even larger lines already being planned. That's not a company hedging a small bet. That's a company that already knows exactly where the demand is going to come from.
Where internet live streamers sell cars in real time. Barely a decade old, XPeng is already in the world's top 10 EV producers.
And is building to meet it years in advance, quietly locking down capacity while the rest of the world was still debating whether sodium was worth taking seriously at all. None of this happened in a single announcement or a single dramatic year. It happened across 5 years of decisions nobody outside the industry was tracking closely. A cathode supply contract signed here, a pilot production line quietly finished there, a budget EV model launched in a market most Western analysts weren't paying attention to. Each one, on its own, looked small enough to ignore. Stacked together, they added up to something no single competitor could easily reverse engineer or catch up to overnight. By the time sodium-ion batteries became a genuine headline story in 2026, the foundation underneath them had already been poured, cured, and built on for half a decade. And that's exactly why the rest of the world is now stuck asking for a seat at a table it didn't even know was being built, until the chairs were already full. The confession no one noticed. Here's the part of this story that didn't make many headlines anywhere, even though it probably should have. In January 2026, a South Korean trade publication called ET News quietly reported on LG Energy Solutions' sodium-ion plans, the same plans that would eventually land the company in Nanjing. Buried in that report was a line that read less like a routine corporate strategy update and more like an unintentional admission. LG was deciding whether to build in the West without any real supply chain support, or build in China and simply accept the structural dependency that came with it. Nobody at LG framed it that dramatically in public. But strip away the corporate language, and that's exactly what the choice came down to. Read that again, slowly. One of the 3 largest battery makers on the entire planet, a company that already supplies Volkswagen, General Motors, and Tesla, with cells running in millions of vehicles, looked at its own home country and its 2 biggest Western markets combined and found nothing solid enough to build on. No cathode suppliers operating at real scale, no anode manufacturers ready to deliver in volume, no equipment vendors who had ever actually built the specialized machines sodium-ion production requires. Korea didn't have it, despite being LG's home turf, despite decades of government support for its battery champions. Europe didn't have it, despite years of public investment aimed squarely at battery independence. North America didn't have it either, despite trade policy explicitly designed to pull manufacturing away from China. 3 of the wealthiest, most industrially advanced regions on Earth, and not one of them had what a company already inside the industry needed to simply get started. This wasn't a failure of ambition or effort on the West's part. Western battery companies weren't sitting still during those years. They were pouring enormous resources into next-generation lithium chemistry, into solid-state battery research, into faster charging technology and longer-lasting cells. Nobody in Korea, Germany, or the United States was being lazy. They were simply looking in a different direction, betting that lithium's dominance would hold long enough for incremental improvements to matter more than a switch to an entirely different raw material most people still associated with table salt, rather than a serious energy source. While that bet was quietly being placed across Western R&D departments, China was building something that never shows up cleanly in a single earnings report or a single press release. An entire manufacturing ecosystem, stacked layer on layer, built specifically around a raw material almost nobody else thought was worth the effort. Cathode processing plants.
Millions of dollars are being poured into the Clarksville area to create a new manufacturing plant for electric vehicle battery parts.
Anode material suppliers, specialized equipment manufacturers who'd never built anything like it before but learned how, one production line at a time, through years of trial and error. Nobody outside the industry was watching. All of it built for sodium chemistry specifically, years before most of the rest of the world had decided sodium chemistry might actually be worth pursuing at all. That kind of infrastructure doesn't get built in a single budget cycle. It takes years of steady, unglamorous investment, made by people willing to bet on something before the rest of the world agrees it's worth betting on. That's what made LG's decision feel less like a surprise and more like an inevitability once you understand the full picture. It wasn't choosing China because China happened to offer the best deal on the table that week. It was choosing China because China was the only place on Earth where the deal existed to begin with. And LG isn't some fringe company making a desperate last resort move out of weakness. It's one of the most sophisticated, well-funded battery companies on the planet, and even it had no meaningful alternative sitting on the table. If a company with LG's resources and reach couldn't find a workaround, it's worth asking how any smaller player is supposed to manage the same problem. That single fact should genuinely worry anyone thinking seriously about the next decade of the battery industry. This was never really a story about one clever product line or one impressive lab result. It's a story about who controls the pipeline the entire global industry will eventually have to run through, no matter whose logo ends up printed on the finished battery pack. It's worth remembering that LG isn't a company known for panic decisions. It's methodical, deliberate.
Engineers were working to clean up the manufacturing process at LG battery plants, factories in South Korea,
and has spent decades building relationships with suppliers around the world, precisely so it never gets boxed into a corner like this. That's exactly what makes the Nanjing decision so telling. A company built to avoid exactly this kind of dependency ran the numbers, checked every alternative available to it, and still ended up choosing China anyway, not out of preference, but because the math simply didn't work any other way. And once one of the most careful, risk-averse players in the entire industry makes that call, it stops being an isolated business decision and starts looking like a signal. Every other battery maker watching from Seoul, Stuttgart, or Detroit now has the same data LG had. The only real difference is how long each of them takes to admit it. What happens next? So where does this actually lead? Not to lithium disappearing overnight. Nobody serious in the industry is predicting that, and this video isn't claiming it either. High-performance EVs, the ones chasing the longest range numbers and the fastest charging speeds for marketing brochures, will likely stick with lithium chemistry for years to come, simply because sodium still can't match its energy density at the very top end. But the top end was never the whole market to begin with, and it never will be. Grid-scale energy storage doesn't need the lightest, most energy-dense battery on Earth. It needs the cheapest battery that can survive thousands of charge cycles without meaningfully degrading, sitting in a fixed location on a concrete pad where weight never mattered in the first place. That's sodium's natural home, and it's a genuinely massive market one that's only going to grow as more wind and solar power gets added to electrical grids that need somewhere to store energy for when the sun isn't shining. So is the fast-growing market for city cars, delivery vans, and short-range fleet vehicles, where a slightly shorter range on paper is a completely fair trade for a battery that costs meaningfully less and never depends on a mineral mined in only 3 or 4 countries on the planet. CATL's mass production timeline puts real sodium-ion cells into real functioning supply chains before the end of 2026. Not as a future promise, but as a current fact. BYD's dedicated production facility will add even more volume on top of that once it comes fully online. JMEV has already proven, quietly and for 2 straight years, that ordinary Chinese consumers will buy sodium-powered cars without hesitation once the price and the range make sense for how they actually drive. And every Western company that wants a real piece of that growing market now has to make the exact same decision. LG Energy Solution already made. build inside China's existing supply chain and accept the dependency, or spend years and billions of dollars trying to build a genuine rival supply chain completely from scratch. That's the real shift buried inside this story. It was never just a story about one clever new battery chemistry finally maturing at the right moment. It's a story about who gets to decide the terms the rest of the global industry has to accept going forward. For the past 2 decades, that kind of leverage sat almost entirely with whoever controlled the world's lithium mines. Now there's a second lever sitting right next to it, and China spent 5 patient years building the entire machine that pulls it, while most of the rest of the world was still watching the first lever closely and assuming that was the only one that mattered. The company, or the country that builds the supply chain first, doesn't just win a single product cycle or a single good headline. It sets the price, the pace, and the rules that everyone who comes after has to play by. Right now, that country is China. The only real question left for everyone else is whether the rest of the world builds its own independent path from here, or simply keeps renting space inside China's for another decade. Governments in Washington, Brussels, and Seoul have all talked publicly about reducing dependence on Chinese battery supply chains. Billions have been pledged toward exactly that goal over the past few years. But pledges take years to turn into working cathode plants, and China already has working cathode plants running today, with contracts locked in through 2029 and expansion plans already underway. The gap isn't measured in ambition anymore, it's measured in years, and every year that passes without a serious Western alternative is another year China's head start compounds. The Nanjing plant is running now, the contracts are signed, and somewhere in a boardroom in Detroit or Seoul, a decision is being made that won't make headlines for another year, but will decide who builds the next generation of everything that needs to store power. China didn't just win a battery race. It quietly wrote the rules for the one that comes after it. The West still has a move left to play. The only question is whether it makes that move before the board is already set, or finds out, too late, that the game ended while everyone was still watching the wrong medal.